When the first Japanese agricultural workers arrived in Brazil in the early 20th century, they weren't missionaries. They were laborers, bringing their Judo Shinshu Buddhism with them into a world that couldn't have been more different. They were surrounded by the overwhelming dominance of Catholicism and the powerful rhythms of Afro-Brazilian faiths. So a quiet, fascinating thing began to happen. To survive, to find their footing, their practice began to blend. You had Buddhist families incorporating elements of Catholicism, even aspects of local spirit traditions right alongside their ancestral practices. It was a unique hybrid faith born not from doctrine, but from necessity. But here is where the story takes its most interesting turn. Today, decades later, you see two things happening at once. On one hand, many of the younger descendants of those original Japanese families are converting away from Buddhism, assimilating into the country's Catholic majority. And at the exact same time, native Brazilians, with no ethnic ties to Asia at all, are becoming deeply drawn to the practice. But they're not interested in the blended rituals or, in many cases, any specific sect. They are bypassing the cultural layers and going straight for the meditation cushions and the core philosophy, creating an entirely new universal form of Brazilian Buddhism. This great reversal, one group leaving as another arrives, a single religion being completely reshaped by two different forces, it makes you wonder, what is it about this teaching that allows it to so radically transform and, in turn, transform the people who find it?
It really is an incredible paradox, isn't it? And that's exactly what we're going to unpack here. You have these two movements happening in parallel that seemed to completely contradict each other.
Exactly. One group is leaving the faith as part of their, final assimilation into the country.
Right. The Japanese Brazilian community, they're achieving full structural success. And for many, that means letting go of what they see as ethnic religious baggage. But at the same time,
at the exact same time, a totally different group, native Brazilians, are flocking to it.
Yes, and they're embracing either a very intellectual, philosophical kind of Buddhism or, and this would be even more common, a very karmic, results-focused practice.
So how do we even begin to understand that? How can a religion both shrink and explode at the same time?
Well, I think to get our heads around it, we have to look at the three major forms of Buddhism that really developed in Brazil over the past century. First, you have what we can call ethnic Buddhism.
The immigrants version.
Exactly. It's all about cultural preservation. And it was forced to blend, to syncretize, just to survive. Then, later, you get the rise of intellectualized Buddhism. This is for the educated middle-class Brazilians who are interested in meditation, philosophy, the texts.
The Zen stuff?
The Zen stuff, largely, yes. And third, and this is a huge piece of the puzzle, you have karmic Buddhism. These are groups like the Nichiren schools that are all about getting immediate, practical, real-world results. So to get the full picture, we have to start at the very beginning with the pioneers and just the huge cultural void they were facing when they first arrived.
Okay, let's do that. Let's go back to 1908. The first ship, the Casado Maru, lands. And it's so important to remember, like you said, these weren't people on a religious mission. They were farmers. They were in a desperate situation.
Desperate is the right word. You have to understand the context in Japan at the time. There were severe agricultural crises. Then, in 1923, the Great Kanto earthquake just devastated the country.
And wasn't there a political reason, too? Something about the U.S.?
Oh, absolutely. The U.S. Immigration Act of 1924 basically slammed the door on any more Japanese migration to the United States. So for a lot of these farmers, Brazil was one of the only options left on the table.
And they brought their religion with them, but as cultural baggage, not as something to spread.
Right. And most of them were adherents of Judo Shinshu, or Pure Land Buddhism.
Yeah.
It was the dominant school among the agrarian communities, focusing on faith in Amida Buddha. It was just what they did. It was part of their identity.
And a key part of that identity was the belief that they were not staying. They were there to make money and go back home. How did that shape their first few decades in Brazil?
It shaped everything. It created this profound resistance to integrating. Why would you learn Portuguese? Why would you adopt Brazilian customs if you believe you're going home in 5, maybe 10 years?
You wouldn't. You'd try to create a little bubble of Japan in the middle of Brazil.
You'd cling to it.
Yeah.
And that mindset immediately crashed into a huge existential problem, the loss of the Aini.
The Aini. Explain what that is.
In Japan, Buddhism wasn't really about your personal spiritual journey, not for most people. It was all tied up in the traditional household system. Your entire religious life was centered on ancestor worship and funeral rites.
So it's a family thing, not an individual thing?
It's a family thing, but it's even more than that. It's corporate. The eldest son had the sacred responsibility of maintaining these rites, the ihai. to ensure the family line continued. It was the absolute bedrock of their social and spiritual world.
And I imagine if you're a poor farmer who just got off a boat in Brazil, you can't just replicate the ice system.
Impossible. The whole scaffolding is gone. You've lost not just your household structure, but also the wider support networks, the duzoku, these corporate groups that helped with everything from rituals to economics.
So the very purpose of their Buddhism was suddenly under threat.
Completely. The reason for the practice to link the living family to the ancestral line was broken. Their religion had to transform from this stable generational ritual into a survival mechanism. It was about holding on to some shred of identity in this alien new world.
And that need must have gotten even stronger when they finally realized they weren't going home, especially after World War II.
That was the absolute turning point. After the war, Brazil's policy shifted. The Japanese were there to stay permanently. And at the same time, the nationalistic parts of their identity, particularly Shinto, were let's say they were strongly discouraged in the new post-war world.
Which left a massive hole.
A huge religious and cultural vacuum. And that's exactly why, when official Buddhist missions from Japan finally started arriving in the early 1950s, their goal wasn't to convert Brazilians.
It was to serve their own community.
Precisely. Their goal was intensely practical. They wanted to create a Buddhist family in Brazil. They focused almost entirely on ancestor worship and providing funeral services. They were literally trying to rebuild the lost eyes system using the temple as the new foundation. It was Buddhism as social infrastructure.
So from the Brazilian perspective, you have this group that's using its religion to stay separate, to preserve its own ethnic identity.
And that set up an immediate division.
Yeah.
You had Japanese religions, Buddhism, Shinto, some new religions, and then you had Brazilian religions, which, meant Catholicism and Spiritist faiths.
And the Japanese religions were defined by what? The language.
The language, for sure. Services were in Japanese, but also by who attended, the Nikki community, and the focus on those traditional family roles, especially the eldest son's responsibility for the rituals.
But this is happening at the exact same time that Brazil is pushing this national ideology of itself as a melting pot.
A violent clash of ideas. Starting in the 1930s, Brazil promoted this idea of mestiçagem, of racial mixture and syncretism, as the core of its national identity.
So the very thing ethnic Buddhism was trying to do, preserve a distinct Japanese identity, was running directly counter to the country's national project.
Exactly. And that put immense pressure on the younger generations. How can you fully integrate into a society that values blending when your own community's religion is designed to keep you separate?
Which brings us right to that core tension. The more successful the Japanese community became at integrating, the less they needed a religion that was just about being Japanese.
It's the ultimate paradox of success. The Japanese Brazilian community is now, by all measures, incredibly successful. High education, high income, fully integrated. But as the pioneers pass away and their grandkids grow up speaking Portuguese and marrying outside the community, that old form of Buddhism is facing a choice.
Adapt or die.
Basically. Redefine yourself in a way that appeals to everyone or just fade away as your ethnic base disappears. But before we get to their failure to hold on to the next generation, we have to look at just how far those pioneers were willing to bend their own rules just to survive in the first place.
This is the part that I find so fascinating, the point where the practical need to keep your community together just completely overrides any sense of doctrinal purity. They were in this overwhelmingly Catholic country, so they started borrowing from Catholicism. How deep did that actually go?
It started with the language, with what academics call relexification. It sounds complicated, but it's simple. They were swapping out words.
Okay.
Since Catholicism was the air they breathed, Japanese Buddhist groups just started using Catholic vocabulary to make their own practices understandable, not just to outsiders, but to their own kids who were growing up speaking Portuguese.
So you'd walk into a Buddhist temple and hear words you'd expect to hear in a church.
Exactly. You'd hear them talk about the Mass or Misa for their services. They'd call their priests Father or Padre. Some groups even use the word catechism for their doctrinal study meetings.
Wow. Catechism.
Think about it from the perspective of a third-generation kid. The Japanese term, osutome, might mean nothing to them. But Mass, they know what a Mass is. It gives the practice a cultural foothold, even if it's a bit superficial.
And it wasn't just words, right? It led into the rituals themselves.
Yes, even into physical gestures. Observers have noted that in some Pure Land temples, during these private family masses for ancestors, some of the older members would occasionally, maybe even unconsciously, make the sign of the cross.
No way.
It shows how blurry the lines were becoming, especially at that very intimate family level. It was a survival tactic, really, swapping a foreign practice for a local one to make it easier for the next generation to connect.
But the blending went even further than that into really powerful, visible symbols. You told me about the iconography.
This is one of the most striking examples. In some traditional Shingon household altars in São Paulo, and these are usually very formal, very structured spaces, you could find an image of Our Lady of Aparecida.
The patroness of Brazil. She's a massive figure in Brazilian culture.
Huge. And she was placed right there on the altar, next to the traditional Shingon mandalas, or a statue of the Buddha.
What does that signify? I mean, that's a huge statement.
It's a profound statement of identity. It's basically saying, we are part of this land now. The spiritual forces that protect Brazil also protect our home. Scholars call this specific kind of substitution replacive relaxification.
So Our Lady of Aparecida takes on the role of a Buddhist figure.
Functionally, yes. She fills the role of a compassionate female deity like Kannon or Kuan Yin in East Asian Buddhism. She was a symbol that was local, powerful, and emotionally resonant. She could stand in for the foreign symbol while doing the same job, offering compassionate help.
That's an incredible bridge to build, but maybe even more dramatic was the blending of esoteric Buddhism, Shingon, with Afro-Brazilian and Spiritist traditions. I mean, that's a huge leap from honoring your ancestors to, what, fighting off black magic?
It sounds like a massive leap doctrinally, but it was driven by something very practical. The need for immediate worldly results. You have to remember the context. In Brazil, especially back then, there were huge gaps in social services. Healthcare, mental health support, you name it.
So people turn to religion for practical help.
For tangible solutions to tangible problems. And the Shingon priests, whose tradition is esoteric, they adapted. They started holding consultations where they would diagnose the spiritual causes of people suffering. And to do that, they borrowed the language of the local faiths.
What kind of language are we talking about?
Terms that everyone in Brazil would immediately understand, including the Nikkei. They'd talk about macumba, which is a general term for bad spirits or kind of black magic, like a curse. Or they'd talk about an encosto.
What's an encosto?
It's the belief that a wandering or deceased spirit can attach itself to you and cause all sorts of problems, illness, bad luck, depression.
So the Shingon priests were using these terms?
Yes, and they would frame their own rituals as the solution. They'd explicitly describe what they were doing as undoing black magic de fazer trabalhos de macumba. Or they would perform a ritual of passes hands to mar, and passe, which is kind of healing touch common in Brazilian Spiritism. They were performing Buddhist rituals, but explaining them using a local spiritual vocabulary.
Wait, so this is more than just borrowing a few words. They were actually adopting the local belief system, the spiritual cause and effect of these other religions.
That is the critical distinction. It's not just swapping vocabulary anymore. It's something called grammar transference. The underlying structure of the local worldview, the idea that you can be cursed, that you need magical protection right now, that whole grammar gets transferred onto the Shingon system.
So instead of your suffering being the result of, some abstract karma from a past life.
Right. It's now seen as an immediate spiritual attack, a macumba, that a specific Shingon ritual can counteract right now in this world. The esoteric practice becomes a tool. It shows just how incredibly adaptable Buddhism can be when it's faced with the real-world needs of a community that's just trying to get by.
So all this blending, this intense syncretism, it was a survival strategy for the first generation, but it clearly wasn't enough to keep the second and third generations in the fold. It feels like the very success of their integration into Brazil is what led to them leaving Buddhism.
That is the painful irony of the whole story. By adopting Brazilian language and symbols, the pioneers were, in a way, paving the road for their descendants to fully assimilate. But in a country that is so structurally Christian, full assimilation often means conversion.
And the data shows this pretty clearly.
It does. Census data shows a really significant evasion, as they call it, from Buddhism among the Nikki community.
There are, about 1.5 million people in the community? But the number who identify as Buddhist is pretty low. So where are they all going?
They're going to Christian churches, mostly Catholic, but increasingly to evangelical Protestant churches as well.
Here's the part that feels so counterintuitive to me. The Nikki community is famously a huge success story in Brazil. We're talking high levels of education, high income. Why would the most successful immigrant group feel the need to convert to fit in?
Because the pressure isn't just economic, it's structural, it's social. For many decades, Converting to the dominant religion is the final step in their integration. Their economic success is secure, but joining a Catholic parish or an evangelical church that secures their social place. It makes it easier to network professionally, to marry outside the Japanese community, to finally shake off that last bit of being seen as foreign.
So the religion of their grandparents was about separation and preservation.
Exactly. And the religion they're adopting, Christianity, is about integration and acceptance. For the Nikki who do stay Buddhist, the function of the religion has become much narrower. It's almost purely a cultural anchor now.
It's about maintaining a connection to their heritage through things like the ancestor cult.
Right. The temple becomes more of a cultural center than a place of active spiritual practice, and it faces this really serious threat of extinction as the pioneers, its main client base, pass away.
So, ethnic Buddhism is shrinking. It's becoming a heritage project for a very successful minority. And at the exact same time, this great reversal kicks in. Native Brazilians with no ethnic connection at all start pouring in.
A fascinating shift. And while the total numbers are still pretty small, the 2000 census had about 245,000 Buddhists. The important thing isn't the raw number, it's the trend. Brazil has a very dynamic religious marketplace. About a quarter of all Brazilian adults have converted to a different religion from the one they were raised in.
It's a free market of faith, and Buddhism found its niche.
It found a few niches, actually. And crucially, the native Brazilian convert is looking for something completely different from what the Nikki pioneers needed.
They don't need the cultural baggage.
They're bypassing it entirely. They want a universal faith, and they're drawn to it for, I think, three main reasons, which really sets up where the story goes next. They want intellectual interpretation Buddhism as a coherent philosophy. They want individual practice, especially meditation for wellness, and they want practical results, a way to solve their problems. That's what saved Buddhism from the Nikki exodus.
So it seems like these new Brazilian converts really split into two main camps. You have the intellectual philosophical types who are drawn to Zen, and then you have the more practical results-oriented people who find their way to what you call karmic Buddhism.
That's a great way to put it. Let's start with that intellectual path. The attraction to Zen, especially Sutta Zen, really follows a global pattern. It's what some scholars call the Protestantization of Buddhism in the West.
What does that mean?
It means it becomes very rational, very focused on texts, it's anti-dogma, and it's all about the individual's inner experience. This wave hit Brazil a bit later than it hit the US or Europe, but it got a huge boost in 1961 when D.T. Suzuki's book, Introduction to Zen Buddhism, was translated into Portuguese.
And who was reading this? Who was this new convert?
Generally, you're looking at educated, urban, middle-class professionals. Their first contact with Buddhism wasn't through a temple, it was through a book. So for them, the practice is all about meditation, zazen, and rational inquiry. It fits really well with a modern, secular mindset.
And because they see it as a philosophy, it doesn't necessarily have to conflict with their existing religious identity.
That's a key part of its appeal in a place like Brazil. For many of these converts, it's not a religion you convert to in an exclusive sense. It's a philosophy of life. It allows for what we call multiple religious affiliations.
So you can be a Catholic who practices Zen meditation.
Absolutely. You see Brazilian Zen masters who will actively draw parallels between Zen concepts and Catholic mystics like St. John of the Cross. Or they'll integrate it with modern psychology. They're framing it as this cosmopolitan modern tool for self-improvement that's compatible with whatever else you believe.
But that success must have caused some serious friction with the old guard Japanese institutions. You mentioned the Bushinji conflict. That sounds like a perfect story of this clash.
It's a textbook example of the growing pains. The Bushinji Temple in São Paulo is the headquarters for Shuchi Zen in all of South America. It was built by and for the conservative Japanese community. The tension exploded when a non-Japanese Brazilian nun, Koen Souza, became a leader there.
She was highly trained, right, in the U.S. and Japan.
Extremely capable. And she was everything the tradition needed to grow in Brazil. She was fluent in Portuguese, deeply knowledgeable, and had zero ethnic baggage. She was a huge success.
She must have attracted a lot of new people.
Thousands of native Brazilians. She started study groups in Portuguese, she made the teachings accessible, but her very success became a threat to the old guard, the Japanese families who controlled the temple's board and finances.
They didn't see her as saving the tradition for a new audience.
They saw her as taking away their cultural anchor. For that older generation, Bushinji's purpose was to preserve Japanese identity. The Japanese language was a kind of fissure that kept it in the family, so to speak. When Koen Souza made it accessible to everyone, the numbers grew. But the old guard felt they were losing control of their heritage.
So what happened?
Well, the friction became unbearable. And despite her incredible success in actually growing the Sangha, she was eventually forced out. She lost her position.
That's an incredible story, and it really signals that the future of this kind of Buddhism in Brazil had to happen outside those original ethnic institutions.
It had to. The Brazilian-led groups, whether they're intellectual or karmic, they're proving they have to build their own structures. Which brings us to the other path, to karmic Buddhism. This is where the real numbers are.
Right, so if Zen is for the educated middle class, it seems like the Nichiren groups are for the urban lower middle class who are looking for real-world solutions.
That's a very good way of framing it. Quantitatively, the Nichiren-based new religions groups like Soka Gakkai, which is called BSGI in Brazil, Honman Butsu Yushu, Ryukai, they have the most followers of any Far Eastern religion in the country, by far.
And their entire approach is different. They're not waiting for people to read a book.
They are actively and sometimes aggressively proselytizing.
Yeah.
BSGI is the biggest player. They claim over 120,000 members, and the really stunning statistic is that 90% of them are non-Japanese Brazilians.
So what's the appeal? What are they offering?
They're offering results. Their entire model is built on what you could call the doctrine of results. You don't convert because you're curious about philosophy. You convert because you have a concrete problem in your life that you need to solve right now. And they promise that the practice will provide actual verification of benefits in this world.
What kind of problems are we talking about?
The most immediate existential problems you can imagine. Financial debt, sickness in the family, you can't find a job, your marriage is falling apart. The practice is marketed as a direct tool to fix these things. Risho Kosekai, another group, took this to an extreme. They offered free treatment for bronchitis and claimed an 80% cure rate.
So they're directly linking faith to a measurable health outcome.
Exactly. It's spiritual self-help. And this practical focus even reshapes traditional ideas like ancestor worship.
How so?
Well, a group like Ryukai teaches that your problems today aren't just from your own karma. They're caused by the negative actions of your ancestors. So, by doing ancestor veneration rituals, you generate merit that fixes your own life here and now. The focus is always on the immediate worldly benefit.
That must be a perfect fit for Brazil's very fluid, syncretic religious landscape.
It fits so well that BSGI had to completely change its core strategy. They originally came in with this very aggressive conversion tactic called shakabuku.
What does that mean?
It literally means break and subdue. It was about crushing other beliefs and demanding total exclusive loyalty.
That doesn't sound like it would go over well in Brazil.
It didn't. And by the mid-90s, they realized it was totally counterproductive. So they switched. They moved from that aggressive exclusivity to a policy of tolerance and even multiple membership. Their leaders now openly say it's fine if you still go to an Umbanda session or a spiritist center. Their reasoning is pragmatic. Everyone has enough intelligence to know what is best for them.
They stopped selling doctrine and started selling results.
Exactly. But there's one more piece to this puzzle of nativization. A third force, which came from outside the Japanese tradition entirely. The globalized Chinese Mahayana Buddhism of Foguang-Shan.
Right, the Zulai Temple. How did they approach it differently?
Foguang-Shan is this huge, modern, global organization. They came to Brazil with a very clear strategy. Promote humanistic Buddhism. That means a focus on social work, ecumenism, and universal values like peace and equality. They completely sidestepped the ethnic baggage that the Japanese groups were struggling with.
And they made it very accessible.
Very. The Zulai Temple attracts Brazilians with things they already find appealing. Chan, or Zen, meditation, Tai Chi classes, vegetarian cooking workshops. They frame Buddhism as a kind of alternative health practice or a progressive philosophy.
And crucially, they got involved in the community in a way the older Japanese temples didn't.
That social engagement was the key. Unlike the old ethnic temples, which were very inward-looking, Foguang-Shan started doing very visible social assistance. They'd host kids from nearby slums or bring in elders from nursing homes for big celebrations like Vesak, which they called the Christmas of Buddha.
That kind of social work builds a lot of goodwill.
It does, and it backs up their message of humanistic Buddhism in a country with so much inequality. They also tried to fill what they saw as an ecumenical gap. They actively tried to unite the different Buddhist schools under this idea that we are all global and we all share Buddha nature. It was a strategy to make the old ethnic and national loyalties just fade into the background.
So looking back at this whole journey, from the pioneers blending their faith to survive, to their descendants leaving it to assimilate, to this flood of new converts, it's so clear that the Brazilian context itself is what drove all this change.
It's the single most important factor. You can't understand Buddhism in Brazil without understanding Brazil. The history of religious blending, the massive social inequality, the gaps in social services, all of this created the specific needs that Buddhism had to adapt to fill.
Which means that Brazilians often adopt parts of a religion for very practical reasons without necessarily buying into the whole doctrinal package.
That's the perfect way to describe it. It's a functional acceptance. Buddhism gets instrumentalized. You see people using meditation just to lower their stress, with no real connection to the goal of enlightenment or the Eightfold Path. The religion gets pulled apart, and its pieces are adapted to fit into the local spiritual toolkit.
And the inherent tolerance in Buddhism makes it a good competitor in that market.
A very effective competitor. The fact that many Buddhist schools don't demand exclusive belief, that they can respect other gods and traditions, makes them a perfect fit for Brazil's pluralistic environment. They can exist alongside Catholicism and Afro-Brazilian faiths without demanding that you choose.
So in the end, we're left with these two parallel stories. The Nikkei community struggled to hold on to their heritage, and the explosive, pragmatic growth of a new, uniquely Brazilian Buddhism.
That's the duality of it. On one side, you have the ethnic temples. They're shrinking, but they're still vital as cultural centers, trying to preserve that Japanese influence through ancestor rites, even as their base is slowly disappearing as the younger generations integrate through Christianity.
And on the other side?
On the other side, you have the convert movements. You have Zen providing philosophy and personal development, and you have the karmic schools providing real-world solutions. Together, they are forging a truly Brazilian form of Buddhism, one that is pragmatic, syncretic, and completely detached from its Japanese ethnic roots. It's a Buddhism that responds directly to the needs of the local spiritual market.
It really makes the story of Buddhism in Brazil kind of a perfect case study for religion in a globalized world.
I think it is. The transformation you see happening in Brazil is a powerful example of how religious identity works in our modern world. As the importance of the nation-state starts to weaken a bit under the pressures of globalization, traditions like religion can step in to fill that void.
They offer a different kind of identity.
Yes, exactly. They offer both a specific, particular history and a universal global message. And so they can become a primary source of your identity, of your community, and your loyalty in a way that's separate from your citizenship. And this really suggests that the future for many of these global religions isn't going to be about doctrinal purity or staying true to how things were done in the homeland. The future will be defined by their willingness to be completely reshaped by local pragmatic needs, by how useful they can be to people who are just looking for real solutions to the very real problems of modern life.